In the summer of 1941, the German Wehrmacht initiated Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, aimed at dismantling the Soviet Union. Within this strategic offensive, the city of Kyiv, capital of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, became a focal point in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. Nestled on the western bank of the Dnipro River and fortified both geographically and militarily, Kyiv stood as a critical node in Soviet defense lines. To understand the magnitude of what would transpire, it is necessary to examine the pre-war circumstances that led to its encirclement and eventual capture. Following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. While this non-aggression treaty temporarily postponed conflict between the two powers, it was always a fragile arrangement. German strategic interests eventually pivoted toward the east, and with the successful campaigns in Western Europe concluded by mid-1940, Adolf Hitler turned his gaze toward the Soviet Union. The ideological motive of Lebensraum, or living space, as well as the destruction of communism, made conflict seem inevitable. Soviet military planning, meanwhile, was hampered by multiple internal and external factors. The purges of the Red Army Officer Corps between 1937 and 1938 significantly degraded the command structure. Marshal Tukhachevsky and numerous capable commanders were executed or imprisoned, replaced by less experienced but politically reliable figures. The result was a weakened strategic backbone, compounded by rigid command doctrines and centralized decision-making. The Red Army's modernization efforts were ongoing but incomplete. New equipment such as T-34 tanks and Katyusha rocket launchers were entering service, but in limited numbers and with logistical complications. The city of Kyiv had seen a strengthening of its fortifications throughout the 1930s, particularly after the Soviet annexation of eastern Poland in 1939, which shifted the border westward. The Kyiv Fortified Region, KFR, a series of bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions, ringed the city. However, many of these defensive works were based on outdated First World War models and had not been adequately updated to counter modern mechanized warfare. Public sentiment in Kyiv and across Soviet Ukraine was tense. Memories of the 1932-33 Holodomor famine and ongoing repression left much of the population ambivalent toward the Soviet regime. Nevertheless, when war broke out on the 22nd of June 1941, mass mobilization was ordered. Kyiv's factories switched to wartime production, and tens of thousands of civilians volunteered or were conscripted into defensive militias. Propaganda reinforced the city's symbolic and strategic value, painting it as a bastion of resistance. The German High Command's strategic thinking placed considerable emphasis on the southern front. Army Group South, led by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was tasked with capturing Ukraine, its industrial centers, and agricultural resources. Kyiv, the largest city in the region, became a primary objective. Simultaneously, Hitler demanded flexibility from the military leadership. While some generals preferred to advance directly toward Moscow, Hitler saw the encirclement and destruction of Soviet forces in Ukraine as a necessary preliminary step. On the Soviet side, the Southwestern Front, commanded by General Mikhail Kirponos, was assigned the defense of Kyiv. His forces included the 5th, 6th, 12th, and 26th Armies. These formations were substantial on paper, but their combat readiness varied widely. Poor communication infrastructure, logistical disarray, and incomplete mobilization rendered many units less effective than anticipated. German intelligence, through aerial reconnaissance and intercepted communications, identified weaknesses in the Soviet deployment. The Wehrmacht prepared for a pincer movement to encircle Kyiv from the north and south, relying on speed, coordination, and armored thrusts. In contrast, the Red Army adopted a static, hold-the-line strategy, underestimating the fluidity and depth of German operational doctrine. Early Soviet counterattacks were piecemeal and often costly, revealing deeper structural flaws in the defense. As July 1941 approached, the German advance gained momentum. Soviet forces found themselves increasingly vulnerable to flanking maneuvers and operational deception. Kyiv's fate would hinge not just on its fortifications or manpower, but on the larger battle for initiative in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. The decisions made in this period, by Stalin, by generals in the field, and by the German High Command, would determine whether Kyiv would withstand the onslaught or become the site of one of the war's most devastating encirclements. The German invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941 opened with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned military analysts. In the southern sector, Army Group South launched its offensive with the 6th, 17th, and 11th Armies, supported by the 1st Panzer Group under General Ewald von Kleist. Their objective was to pierce through Soviet defensive lines in western Ukraine and advance toward key cities, including Kyiv. The initial days of Operation Barbarossa saw rapid breakthroughs, especially as Luftwaffe strikes crippled Soviet airfields and disrupted lines of communication. Bridges, rail hubs, and command posts were targeted with precision, leaving the Red Army reeling from both physical and organizational blows. General Mikhail Kirponos, tasked with organizing the defense of Kyiv, quickly found himself in an increasingly untenable position. His southwestern front was stretched thin across a vast sector, from the Pripyat marshes in the north to the Carpathian foothills in the south. Orders from Moscow, often delivered with delay or inconsistency, added confusion to already strained operations. The Soviet High Command, or Stavka, initially hesitated to authorize large-scale withdrawals, fearing a domino effect of retreat. Instead, Kirponos was instructed to hold positions at all costs. By early July, German forces had already taken Lviv and were pushing eastward. The 1st Panzer Group executed deep thrusts aimed at Dnipro crossings, bypassing heavily defended zones and exploiting gaps between Soviet armies. Kyiv, while not immediately threatened, became a logistical and strategic focus. Reinforcements were redirected to its vicinity, including reserve rifle divisions, artillery regiments, and militia units formed from factory workers and civil servants. These formations, while numerous, lacked training, modern weapons, and often coherent leadership. The German strategy relied on encirclement rather than frontal assault. While infantry formations engaged Soviet defenders along fixed lines, panzer divisions spearheaded flanking maneuvers. In early August, German armor crossed the Dniester and Bug rivers, opening a corridor that led toward the Dnipro bend. The encirclement plan was now evident: strike southward from the Smolensk direction and northward from the Black Sea coast, eventually meeting near the Dnipro to trap Soviet forces in a massive pocket west of Kyiv. Despite growing evidence of a large-scale envelopment, Soviet command continued to issue contradictory orders. Some units were told to retreat while others were directed to launch counteroffensives. This fragmented response played into German hands. Communications breakdowns were frequent, and the destruction of Soviet radio stations forced commanders to rely on couriers or prearranged timetables, methods ill-suited for the pace of mechanized warfare. On the ground, morale among Soviet troops varied. Veterans of the Winter War were hardened and committed, but younger conscripts and newly mobilized civilians often lacked discipline and experience. Reports from the front described disorganized withdrawals, units running out of ammunition, and tanks being abandoned due to fuel shortages. Nonetheless, in pockets, Soviet defenders mounted stubborn resistance. Bridges over the Dnipro were mined and blown, delaying German advances. Artillery batteries dug into the hills around Kyiv unleashed volleys on advancing formations, exacting a toll despite their eventual overrun. Within Kyiv, preparations for siege intensified. Trenches were dug across parks and streets, sandbags piled around key buildings, and cultural artifacts moved to the east. The population faced curfews and air raid drills, while rationing and blackouts became routine. Propaganda broadcasts urged civilians to defend their city to the last drop of blood. Though the atmosphere was tense, there was also a sense of defiance. Kyiv, with its long history and symbolic importance, was not to be surrendered easily. The first major clashes near Kyiv occurred in late July and early August along the Irpin and Dnipro lines. Here, German reconnaissance units tested the strength of Soviet defenses, while artillery bombardments softened positions. Luftwaffe dominance in the skies limited Soviet mobility and left troop concentrations exposed. Nonetheless, the Soviet command maintained an outward confidence, underestimating the scope of the maneuver developing behind their lines. As August wore on, the danger of encirclement grew more pronounced. German forces advancing from the north near Gomel and from the south past Uman threatened to meet east of Kyiv. But instead of authorizing a general withdrawal, the Stavka instructed Kirponos to hold the line. The belief persisted that a resolute defense might allow for a counterstroke, or at least delay the enemy until reinforcements could arrive from the interior. In reality, the Wehrmacht's operational tempo left little room for strategic improvisation. Soviet forces west of Kyiv were already being pushed into vulnerable positions. The opening phase of the Kyiv operation had laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most catastrophic encirclements in modern military history. The Germans, advancing with precision and speed, were tightening the noose, and the defenders of Kyiv, though determined, were increasingly cut off from coordination, supply, and retreat. The strategic objectives of both sides in the struggle for Kyiv were rooted in broader operational designs that would shape the Eastern Front. For the German High Command, Kyiv represented a keystone in the conquest of Ukraine. Its capture would not only disrupt Soviet command structures in the south, but also facilitate control over the Dnipro River, a critical geographic barrier. Moreover, success in Ukraine would secure access to agricultural and industrial resources, particularly the Donbas coal fields, and pave the way toward the Caucasus and its vital oil reserves. Thus, Hitler insisted on prioritizing the southern encirclement, even against the objections of some generals who favored a direct thrust toward Moscow. The Wehrmacht strategy was centered on blitzkrieg principles, rapid advances using combined arms, concentrated armor, and air superiority. The plan called for a wide envelopment. Von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group would move from the south, while Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group, originally operating toward Moscow, was ordered to wheel southward toward the rear of the Soviet southwestern front. This maneuver, if executed successfully, would trap Soviet forces in a vast cauldron west of Kyiv. On the Soviet side, strategic thinking was fragmented and often reactive. The Stavka, under Stalin's influence, maintained a rigid commitment to forward defense. Retreat was seen not only as militarily unacceptable but politically dangerous. Orders emphasized holding ground at all costs, despite growing evidence that German forces were executing massive flanking movements. The Southwestern Front's commander, Kirponos, along with his chief of staff, Tupikov, and military commissar Burmistenko, expressed concerns about encirclement. However, these warnings were overruled by directives from the Supreme Command in Moscow. Soviet logistics were severely strained by the tempo of operations. Many supply depots had been overrun or abandoned during the initial German advance. Rail lines were vulnerable to Luftwaffe interdiction, and fuel shortages plagued armored formations. The Red Army attempted to reinforce the Kyiv axis by transferring units from the interior, but these formations arrived piecemeal and were often thrown into battle without adequate coordination or reconnaissance. Moreover, the complexity of moving tens of thousands of troops under constant aerial bombardment led to chaos and attrition even before units reached the front. Meanwhile, German logistics, though more efficient, were beginning to feel the pressure of extended supply lines. The rapid advance left panzer divisions outpacing their infantry and resupply columns. Fuel convoys were often delayed or disrupted by Soviet partisans operating behind the lines. Despite these challenges, the Wehrmacht maintained initiative through centralized planning and flexible execution. Mobile communications and decentralized command allowed for real-time adjustments, a stark contrast to the more bureaucratic Soviet system. Propaganda played a significant role in shaping morale and perception. In Germany, official communiques portrayed the operation as a continuation of unstoppable momentum. Maps in newspapers showed bold arrows sweeping across Ukraine. In the USSR, Soviet media downplayed losses and emphasized heroic resistance. Kyiv was described as a fortress city whose fall would never be permitted. Broadcasts extolled the bravery of its defenders, while civilians were urged to support the war effort through labor and sacrifice. Despite outward optimism, internal Soviet reports conveyed mounting concern. NKVD files from the period reveal increasing desertion rates, rumors of German superiority, and widespread confusion among reserve formations. Nonetheless, there were also reports of exceptional bravery, units fighting to the last man, engineers blowing bridges under fire, and civilians volunteering for sabotage missions. The contradiction between grim reality and official narrative deepened as the German encirclement neared completion. One of the most significant strategic miscalculations came from Stalin himself. He misjudged the German shift in operational focus and continued to expect a primary offensive toward Moscow. The diversion of Guderian's panzers southward to complete the Kyiv encirclement was initially seen as a sign of German indecision, not as a calculated maneuver. This misreading delayed Soviet efforts to adapt or reposition their forces. By early September, the German pincers were closing. The 2nd Panzer Group had crossed the Desna River and was moving rapidly toward the Dnipro from the north. Simultaneously, von Kleist's units pushed north from Kirovohrad, aiming to link with Guderian's forces. The Soviet 5th and 37th Armies, positioned to the west of Kyiv, now faced encirclement from multiple directions. Efforts to organize a breakout were hampered by conflicting orders and the destruction of communications infrastructure. Some Soviet divisions attempted to push eastward, but found themselves blocked by mobile German detachments or immobilized by lack of fuel and coordination. As the German trap solidified, the Soviets faced a stark choice: attempt a desperate retreat or remain and fight in isolation. Neither option offered much hope. The culmination of strategic planning, logistical imbalance, and command failures had set the stage for catastrophe. The fate of Kyiv and the hundreds of thousands defending it now hung in the balance. The first engagements west of Kyiv unfolded with mounting intensity as German armored spearheads exploited gaps in the Soviet line. These early confrontations were marked not by decisive pitched battles, but by a series of rapid encroachments, tactical bypasses, and localized resistance that gradually revealed the strategic situation. The Red Army was being outmaneuvered on a massive scale. By mid-August, the Wehrmacht's southern pincer, comprising von Kleist's 1st Panzer Group, had broken through near Uman, annihilating several Soviet armies in the process. This victory cleared the way for a northern push toward the Dnipro Bend and the rear of the Kyiv defenses. The territory between the Dnipro and the Bug rivers became a battleground of constant movement. Towns like Bila Tserkva, Korsun-Shevchenkivsky, and Cherkasy saw intense fighting as Soviet formations attempted to establish new defensive lines. These efforts were hindered by disjointed command and delayed reinforcements. Moreover, the Luftwaffe maintained uncontested air superiority in the region, bombing supply columns, railway junctions, and retreating infantry with impunity. Soviet air support, fragmented and frequently grounded by logistical issues, was unable to offer a consistent counter. Civilians in central Ukraine faced immediate consequences. As front lines shifted rapidly, entire communities found themselves caught between retreating Soviet units and advancing German forces. Reports described mass evacuations, destruction of infrastructure, and widespread requisitioning by both armies. NKVD units conducted rearguard actions and summary executions of suspected collaborators, while German advance units often carried out reprisals against partisan activity or perceived resistance. The civilian toll began to mount, not just from violence, but from the complete breakdown of food distribution, shelter, and medical services. On the battlefield, initial Soviet counterattacks were piecemeal and reactive. Commanders in the southwestern front attempted to deploy newly formed units from Kharkiv and Poltava to bolster threatened sectors. However, these formations lacked cohesion and were often thrown directly into combat with little preparation. Some divisions, like the 284th Rifle Division, found themselves encircled shortly after arriving on the front. In response, Soviet command implemented increasingly desperate measures. Militia battalions composed of factory workers were rushed to the outskirts of Kyiv, while NKVD troops were tasked with maintaining discipline, sometimes at gunpoint. Despite the deteriorating situation, resistance around Kyiv remained fierce. The Irpin River defensive line, bolstered by remnants of the 37th Army and local militias, briefly stalled German reconnaissance units. In the city itself, air raid sirens became a daily occurrence as Luftwaffe bombers targeted bridges, rail stations, and industrial zones. The Darnitsia rail hub, a key logistical node for Soviet operations, suffered repeated strikes that hampered the movement of reinforcements and supplies. By late August, the German 2nd Panzer Group had swung southeast from the Smolensk direction, crossing the Desna River and approaching Lokvitsia and Romny. This maneuver threatened the rear of Soviet forces still defending Kyiv and the Dnipro line. Soviet attempts to halt Guderian's advance with elements of the 40th and 21st Armies achieved limited success. The pace and coordination of German mobile warfare, combined with Soviet indecision at the highest levels, meant that gaps continued to appear in the front. Red Army units often found themselves surrounded or fragmented before they could even establish defensive positions. An atmosphere of dread spread through Soviet command posts as the scale of the encirclement operation became undeniable. Desperate messages were relayed to Stavka, urging permission for a withdrawal. Yet Stalin, fearing the psychological and strategic cost of losing Kyiv, refused to allow a retreat. The orders remained clear: hold positions at all costs. This decision sealed the fate of tens of thousands of soldiers trapped in the closing German pincer. Meanwhile, German forces refined their encirclement strategy. Motorized infantry and armored reconnaissance units moved ahead of the main force, cutting off key crossroads, bridges, and rivers. Soviet commanders who attempted to organize breakout attempts found themselves facing mechanized screens backed by well-positioned artillery and air support. Even where terrain favored the defenders, forests, marshes, or riverbanks, German firepower and coordination prevailed. The Wehrmacht's doctrine of deep battle and operational encirclement was being executed with brutal efficiency. The fall of towns like Lubny and Priluki signaled the final stages of the encirclement. Communication between the front lines and Kyiv headquarters became sporadic or ceased altogether. Field telephones went silent, radio operators were captured or killed, and couriers vanished en route. In the chaos, some units fought on without orders, defending entrenched positions until ammunition or men ran out. Others attempted to move eastward in fragmented columns, often only to be destroyed by German ambushes. As the encirclement neared completion, Kyiv's defenders were no longer part of a coherent front. They were becoming isolated pockets within an operational vacuum. The Red Army was losing not only territory and personnel, but also the ability to respond with unified command. In the face of a meticulously planned and dynamically executed German campaign, the Soviet defense of Kyiv was shifting from strategic resistance to a desperate struggle for survival. By early September 1941, the encirclement of Soviet forces defending Kyiv was no longer a possibility, but a developing reality. The German Wehrmacht, through coordinated armored thrusts and methodical infantry advances, had carved a massive arc around the city and its defenders. The forces of von Kleist and Guderian were closing in from the south and northeast, respectively, aiming to link near Lokvitsia and complete the trap. For the Red Army, this marked the beginning of a crisis phase, characterized by fragmentation of command, loss of operational coherence, and mounting casualties under relentless German pressure. The first signs of total collapse appeared in communication reports. Messages from forward units ceased arriving. Some divisions simply disappeared from Soviet order of battle rosters, swallowed by the fast-moving tide of German armor. Soviet headquarters in Kyiv, still under the authority of General Mikhail Kirponos, became increasingly isolated. While local defenses held in scattered formations, there was no longer a unified operational picture. The Southwestern Front had, for all practical purposes, lost control over large portions of its own forces. German forces continued to push eastward across the Dnipro tributaries with devastating effect. Towns and river crossings that could serve as potential escape corridors were seized one by one. The capture of Romny and Lokvitsia marked a crucial moment. Guderian's panzers had successfully linked up with von Kleist's spearheads. With this maneuver, over 600,000 Soviet troops were now trapped in what would become the largest encirclement in military history. The Kyiv pocket, or Kessel, as German commanders termed it, had been sealed. Within the encirclement, the conditions rapidly deteriorated. The Red Army troops found themselves with minimal supplies, no reliable communication, and increasing disorganization. Attempts to regroup were hampered by confusion, the destruction of command posts, and the rapid redeployment of German forces to block every plausible exit. Units that had once been full-strength divisions were now reduced to disjointed battalions, many lacking artillery, armor, or even functioning radios. The terrain, forests, river valleys, and farmlands offered some concealment, but little strategic cover against the superior maneuverability of German mechanized units. Soviet command in Moscow remained paralyzed by a refusal to acknowledge the full extent of the disaster. Stalin only authorized a partial withdrawal on the 17th of September, by which point the encirclement was already closing. Kirponos and his staff, determined to obey orders to the letter, attempted to hold defensive positions while preparing for a breakout that had little chance of success. In one of the most consequential decisions of the campaign, Kirponos and his entourage decided to remain with the troops rather than evacuate. Their decision, though valiant, would ultimately lead to their deaths. German forces maintained their operational tempo with ruthless precision. Artillery and airstrikes pounded concentrations of Soviet troops attempting to organize breakout columns. Mobile blocking detachments, equipped with tanks and anti-tank guns, set ambushes along forest tracks and river crossings. Supply was impossible. Food, medical supplies, and ammunition began to run out. Wounded soldiers were left behind in makeshift field hospitals or evacuated by foot, only to be intercepted and captured. The human cost escalated dramatically. Entire regiments were annihilated or taken prisoner. NKVD units, charged with maintaining order and discipline, often chose to destroy documents and shoot prisoners rather than risk them falling into enemy hands. Instances of mass executions, both by retreating Soviet units and advancing German ones, became more frequent. Civilians attempting to flee with the soldiers faced the same fate as the regular troops: entrapment, bombardment, and either death or captivity. Inside Kyiv, the atmosphere was one of exhaustion and dread. The city, though still under Soviet control, was within striking distance of German artillery and reconnaissance units. Industrial plants lay in ruins, and public order began to fray. The Darnitsia area, already devastated by aerial bombing, saw fires rage unchecked. Political commissars organized last-ditch efforts to raise militia battalions from the remaining male population, including adolescents and the elderly. By now, even the most hardened party officials understood that Kyiv could not be held indefinitely. In desperation, fragmented Red Army units within the pocket attempted breakout maneuvers. These were often uncoordinated and undertaken at night to avoid Luftwaffe detection. Few succeeded. German infantry and SS divisions had encircled the region with such density that even small groups found escape impossible. Soviet tanks, when available, were outgunned or immobilized due to fuel shortages. Riflemen, lacking maps or leadership, wandered into enemy lines or were cut down in fields and forests as they tried to flee. The NKVD reported that soldiers were burying their identification papers to avoid retribution in captivity. Officers disposed of insignias, and many men surrendered in groups rather than face starvation or annihilation. German units, overwhelmed by the number of prisoners, began transporting them in columns hundreds of meters long, marching eastward toward makeshift POW camps already filled beyond capacity. By late September, Kyiv's defenders had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning military force. The German encirclement was complete, the Soviet command structure decapitated, and the road into the Ukrainian heartland lay wide open. What began as a determined defense had become a human catastrophe of staggering proportions. The battle was not yet officially over, but the Soviet position was irreversibly shattered. The peak of the Kyiv campaign came in the final days of September 1941, as German forces completed the largest encirclement ever executed in modern warfare. By this point, the Kyiv pocket had collapsed into dozens of disorganized, starving, and desperate Soviet formations, trapped between converging German infantry and mobile armored divisions. What had started as a defensive operation to protect a major Soviet city now culminated in a military and humanitarian catastrophe. The most intense combat operations occurred during the final breakout attempts. Red Army units, now fragmented into clusters of varying strength, launched desperate offensives to breach the German ring, often without artillery support, air cover, or coordination. In some sectors, Soviet soldiers charged across open fields against entrenched German machine gun nests. In others, tanks with dwindling fuel supplies were used for brief, brutal thrusts against well-prepared roadblocks. The result was slaughter. German field reports speak of hundreds of Soviet troops being mowed down in single engagements, entire regiments reduced to isolated survivors within hours. German commanders exploited their overwhelming tactical advantage with ruthless efficiency. Blocking positions were reinforced daily, supported by 88 mm anti-tank guns, mobile artillery, and Luftwaffe bombing raids. Fighter bombers, operating from forward airfields, strafed and bombed columns of retreating or attacking Soviet troops with impunity. Forest clearings and river crossings became killing zones. The Wehrmacht's logistics, though strained by the sheer scale of the operation, were still effective enough to deliver ammunition and reinforcements where needed. Meanwhile, the Soviets fought with diminishing resources, growing fatigue, and fading hope. Inside the pocket, the situation was catastrophic. Water sources became contaminated, and food ran out entirely. Horses were butchered, and medical supplies were scavenged from corpses. Discipline collapsed in some units, leading to desertions, looting, and fratricide. NKVD detachments attempted to restore order through threats and executions, but their authority waned as the encirclement tightened. Survivors of the campaign described days without sleep, hiding in woods by day and marching by night, constantly dodging patrols, artillery, and aircraft. The command structure of the Southwestern Front disintegrated completely when General Kirponos, refusing to abandon his men, attempted to escape with his remaining staff through a narrow corridor near Lokvitsia. On the 20th of September, he was mortally wounded during a German ambush in a forested area. The loss of the front commander symbolized the final collapse of organized Soviet resistance in the region. His death was followed by the capture or death of multiple senior officers, effectively decapitating what remained of the Soviet leadership in the pocket. As the encirclement drew to its brutal conclusion, German infantry systematically cleared villages, woods, and field positions. They captured tens of thousands of exhausted, starving prisoners. In many cases, resistance had ceased altogether. Men simply laid down their weapons, sometimes without ever firing a shot. German logistics were overwhelmed by the sheer number of POWs. Prisoners were gathered into improvised holding pens without food, water, or medical attention. Thousands died within days from dehydration, disease, or mistreatment. Kyiv itself, now nearly devoid of defenders, was entered by German forces on the 19th of September. The city, though not heavily damaged in direct combat, bore the scars of weeks of aerial bombardment, sabotage, and scorched earth preparations. Soviet demolition teams had destroyed bridges and rail lines, and NKVD units had mined major administrative buildings. German engineers quickly moved in to secure infrastructure and suppress any remaining resistance. The city was declared under German control within days. One of the most notorious consequences of Kyiv's capture occurred shortly afterward, the Babi Yar massacre. Beginning on the 29th of September, over 33,000 Jews were executed in a ravine on the city's outskirts by SS units and German police battalions with the support of local collaborators. Though not directly tied to the military battle, the massacre became one of the earliest and most horrific acts of the Holocaust on Soviet soil. It underscored the ideological dimension of the Nazi invasion and the terror that would now descend on the occupied population. For the German High Command, the victory was resounding. Nearly 665,000 Soviet troops were reported captured, along with thousands of tanks, guns, and supplies. The destruction of the southwestern front opened a clear path to the industrial Donbass and beyond to Rostov and the Caucasus. Propaganda celebrated the battle as a triumph of German military genius. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and Guderian received accolades, while Hitler himself viewed the victory as validation of his southern strategy. In Moscow, the news was received with disbelief and silence. Official Soviet statements minimized the loss or remained vague. Internally, the Stavka recognized the defeat as unprecedented. The entire strategic situation on the Eastern Front was now in question. Stalin, having misjudged the scale and scope of the German maneuver, began reassessing his command methods and eventually empowered a more flexible and decentralized approach to warfare. But in the immediate aftermath, the Red Army was left reeling, and a vast swath of Ukraine lay in enemy hands. The peak of the Kyiv campaign revealed the strengths and weaknesses of both sides. The German forces had demonstrated operational brilliance, mobility, and coordination, while the Red Army had shown courage under fire but suffered from inflexible leadership, poor logistics, and catastrophic strategic miscalculations. The fall of Kyiv was not merely a military event, it was a turning point in the brutal war for the East, the scale and savagery of which was only beginning to unfold. In the aftermath of Kyiv's fall, scattered Soviet forces trapped within the encirclement zones attempted to resist in any way they could. Though the organized military defense had collapsed, the struggle did not entirely end. Isolated formations, remnants of divisions, and civilian volunteers coalesced into ad hoc groups, launching counterattacks and sabotage missions in the German rear. The chaos of the encirclement gave rise to a new phase of the conflict, one defined by adaptation, improvisation, and asymmetric resistance. Some of the most determined resistance came from what remained of the Soviet 5th, 21st, and 37th Armies. These formations, though fragmented, refused to surrender outright. Local commanders organized breakout attempts, often under the cover of darkness and without any knowledge of terrain or enemy positions. In forests around Pryluki, Lubny, and Lokvitsia, units dug in, repurposed damaged artillery, and laid ambushes. Civilians provided limited support, food, water, and information, but many were afraid to be seen helping the Red Army, given the harsh German reprisals that followed any sign of collaboration. Improvised tactics became necessary for survival. With ammunition in short supply and supply lines severed, soldiers relied on scavenged German equipment, makeshift explosives, and guerrilla tactics. Bridges were sabotaged, communication lines cut, and isolated German patrols ambushed. Though such actions had limited impact on the larger course of the campaign, they demonstrated the Soviet will to resist even in the most hopeless conditions. In many cases, this local defiance sowed the seeds of what would later become fully organized partisan movements across occupied Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Soviet government scrambled to reconstitute its military capabilities in the rear. Stalin authorized new formations to be created deep behind the front, particularly in regions east of the Dnipro. Reserve forces were mobilized en masse. Entire factories were evacuated from Kyiv and Kharkiv to the Urals to preserve industrial output. Within weeks, conscripts from across the Soviet Union were assembled, armed, and dispatched to replace the massive losses suffered at Kyiv. However, the quality and readiness of these troops varied significantly. A significant psychological toll afflicted both Soviet soldiers and civilians. Survivors of the Kyiv pocket described feelings of abandonment, betrayal, and disorientation. Many units had fought for weeks without any meaningful support or clear orders. Reports of executions by German troops and reprisals against prisoners filtered back through newly captured areas, reinforcing the perception of a ruthless enemy. Conversely, Soviet propaganda sought to reframe the defeat as a heroic sacrifice. Newspapers that had previously praised Kyiv's defenders now spoke of their immortal courage and eternal glory, even as the Red Army tried to recover from the disaster. The civilian population under occupation experienced a rapid and brutal transformation. German military administration, often working in tandem with Einsatzgruppen and auxiliary police units, imposed strict controls on food, movement, and information. Property was confiscated. Ukrainian collaborators were recruited to assist in governance and repression, creating deep divisions within communities. The city of Kyiv, once a vibrant cultural and political center, became the seat of a brutal occupation regime marked by censorship, curfews, and mass executions. In the countryside, resistance simmered. Soviet authorities had pre-positioned caches of weapons and supplies for use by potential partisans, and small groups began forming in the forests of Poltava and Chernihiv. These early units operated with minimal coordination or outside support, but would over time evolve into a significant element of Soviet strategy. By the winter of 1941-42, partisan warfare in Ukraine would become a growing threat to German logistics and morale. Soviet command began studying the Kyiv disaster in detail, searching for lessons. The inflexibility of high command, the failure to adapt to German maneuver warfare, and the lack of initiative at lower levels were all identified as key issues. Reforms were slowly introduced. Field officers were granted more discretion, communication procedures were updated, and political interference, while never eliminated, was partially curtailed to improve battlefield responsiveness. These changes, born from necessity, would contribute to future Soviet successes as the war ground on. Despite the overwhelming loss, the memory of Kyiv's defense became a powerful symbol in Soviet wartime culture. Monuments, books, and later films would portray the battle not as a defeat, but as a testament to sacrifice and resilience. The reality on the ground, however, was far more complex, a combination of tragic miscalculation, extraordinary human suffering, and an evolving capacity for adaptation in the face of catastrophe. The defense of Kyiv was no longer an active military campaign. It had become an aftermath defined by improvised resistance, forced transformation, and the brutal adjustment to life under occupation. It was here, in this uncertain and volatile interlude, that the Red Army and the Soviet people began laying the groundwork for the long, bitter road toward eventual retaliation. The turning point of the Kyiv campaign came not in a single moment, but through a culmination of failures and consequences that finally shattered the Soviet hold on Ukraine's capital. The German encirclement, once theoretical, had become a hardened and inescapable trap. By late September 1941, the Wehrmacht had achieved what its commanders considered a textbook operation in deep envelopment. For the Red Army, the shift in momentum was catastrophic. The destruction of the Southwestern Front marked the first great Soviet collapse of the war on an operational level. The final stages of the German maneuver, linking Guderian's panzer forces advancing from the north with von Kleist's from the south, created a sealed cauldron containing hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. The encirclement was completed around the 16th of September. At that moment, resistance inside the pocket became almost entirely disconnected from any external support. No supply, no air support, no communications, and no reinforcements. The remnants of multiple Soviet armies were left to fight independently or attempt breakouts with only fragmented intelligence and limited resources. Despite the overwhelming odds, Soviet soldiers continued to resist in isolated engagements. Some commanders still believed that a breakout could be organized if enough forces converged at a narrow corridor near Romny or Pryluki, but these hopes were crushed when German blocking units, reinforced by artillery and air cover, repelled every major escape attempt. Soviet columns advancing through the woods were annihilated by pre-registered fire zones, while tanks and trucks bogged down in soft terrain became stationary targets for German dive bombers. The death of General Kirponos on the 20th of September, during a final breakout attempt, sealed the fate of what remained of the Southwestern Front's leadership. His death, along with that of other high-ranking officers, eliminated any realistic chance of organizing resistance inside the pocket. In many cases, Soviet units surrendered en masse, preferring capture over annihilation. Others simply disintegrated, their men dispersing into the countryside. German reports noted growing numbers of exhausted, unarmed Soviet soldiers emerging from the forests with hands raised, their uniforms torn and boots missing. The psychological collapse that accompanied this military defeat had implications far beyond the battlefield. Inside the Soviet Union, the loss of Kyiv reverberated through the population and the military alike. For soldiers on other fronts, the scale of the disaster was both shocking and demoralizing. It became clear that the Red Army was not only vulnerable but strategically unprepared for the kind of mobile, deep-penetration warfare that the Wehrmacht had perfected. Within the Politburo and Stavka, debates intensified over how to regain initiative, with growing urgency to adopt more flexible, decentralized tactics that could counter German speed and precision. For Germany, the fall of Kyiv and the capture of over 500,000 prisoners confirmed the effectiveness of their southern strategy. Hitler, who had insisted on diverting Guderian's forces from the central drive toward Moscow, saw the Kyiv encirclement as a personal vindication. The success provided a morale boost for the Wehrmacht and lent weight to the argument that the Red Army could be destroyed piecemeal in a series of strategic encirclements rather than through a single knockout blow. However, this operational success also came with strategic consequences. The diversion of armored units southward, while tactically brilliant, delayed the planned offensive on Moscow by several critical weeks. The early October push toward the Soviet capital, Operation Typhoon, would begin under increasingly adverse weather conditions. The window for a quick victory before winter narrowed significantly. The turning point at Kyiv, therefore, was a double-edged sword. It marked the high point of German operational capability in the south, but it also disrupted the broader timeline of the Eastern campaign. Moreover, the occupation of Kyiv and central Ukraine came with new challenges. The destruction of infrastructure, the sheer scale of territory to control, and the hostile or traumatized civilian population all posed long-term problems for German forces. While the military victory was absolute, the political and logistical burdens of holding the region began to grow. The partisan threat, still embryonic, would soon metastasize into a full-blown insurgency, further straining German resources. For the Soviet Union, the fall of Kyiv was not just a defeat, it was a revelation. It forced a systemic reckoning with the realities of modern warfare. The traditional Soviet doctrine of rigid defense and massive concentration of force had failed disastrously. In the wake of Kyiv's collapse, changes began. Field commanders were given more autonomy, operational deception became a formalized element of Soviet strategy, and mass mobilization efforts were intensified. The disaster thus became the catalyst for a long, painful transformation within the Red Army. In this sense, the Kyiv encirclement became more than a battle. It was a crucible. One side, at its apex, demonstrated the full capability of its mechanized doctrine. The other, in ruin, began the slow and difficult process of learning how to fight a modern war. The consequences of this moment would not be limited to 1941. They would shape the entire trajectory of the conflict on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht had won a tremendous battle, but in doing so, it had stirred a force that would eventually grow into a relentless and adaptive war machine. The turning point had come, not in favor of one side permanently, but in the nature of the war itself. As the fighting subsided and Kyiv came under full German control, the scale of devastation left in the wake of the encirclement became fully apparent. The battle's end did not bring relief, but instead ushered in a phase of brutal occupation, humanitarian crisis, and political upheaval. The aftermath of the Kyiv catastrophe extended far beyond military consequences. It left deep scars across Ukraine's civilian population, crippled Soviet command structures, and set the tone for how total war would unfold in the East. The number of prisoners taken by the Wehrmacht in and around Kyiv exceeded 600,000, though exact figures remain debated due to discrepancies in field reports and the chaotic conditions of surrender. The logistical burden of handling such a massive influx of captives quickly overwhelmed German capabilities. Makeshift camps were established in open fields with no sanitation, food, or shelter. Thousands died within days of exposure, disease, and starvation. The German command, adhering to Nazi ideological views of Slavic inferiority, made little effort to provide even minimal care. POWs were marched east in long columns, many collapsing along the way. Those unable to walk were often executed on the spot. The destruction of Soviet formations was equally severe in material terms. Over 3,000 tanks, 1,200 artillery pieces, and tens of thousands of transport vehicles were either destroyed or captured. The Red Army's capacity to conduct large-scale operations in Ukraine was, for the moment, extinguished. The Southwestern Front ceased to exist. Entire unit rosters vanished. Soviet attempts to rebuild military strength in the region would take months and require substantial reallocation of resources from other sectors. The civilian toll was likewise immense. In the wake of the Soviet retreat and German advance, mass evacuations had been chaotic and incomplete. Thousands of Kyiv residents remained in the city when the Wehrmacht entered. Soviet authorities, fearing what would follow, had already executed political prisoners and sabotaged critical infrastructure. The NKVD mined administrative buildings, power plants, and key junctions. These demolition efforts continued even after the city's fall, most notably in the explosion of the main NKVD headquarters on Khreshchatyk Street on the 24th of September, which killed hundreds of German soldiers and local civilians. In retaliation, the occupying forces initiated mass arrests, executions, and collective punishments. Kyiv's fall marked the beginning of an occupation regime that would implement the broader Nazi plans for the East. Einsatzgruppen units, mobile SS death squads, moved in immediately behind the front line. Their mission was clear: eliminate Jews, communists, partisans, and anyone deemed a threat to German authority. Within weeks, the city witnessed one of the most infamous atrocities of the Holocaust, the Babi Yar massacre. On 30th of September 1941, more than 33,000 Jews were rounded up and murdered in a ravine just outside the city. The killings were systematic and public, carried out with the assistance of local collaborators and documented by German photographers and officers. It was not only a mass murder, it was a signal that the war in the East was to be one of annihilation. The occupation brought forced labor, economic exploitation, and the breakdown of civil order. German authorities seized property, requisitioned food, and implemented a brutal regime of surveillance and reprisal. Any sign of resistance, real or imagined, resulted in immediate retaliation. Villages burned, hostages taken, and public hangings carried out to instill fear. The Ukrainian population was divided in its response. Some welcomed the end of Stalinist repression, hoping for independence. Others quickly recognized the nature of the new regime and either fled or joined emerging underground resistance movements. For the Soviet Union, the loss of Kyiv represented more than a military disaster, it was a national trauma. Stalin, though initially silent, soon began efforts to reframe the event in propagandistic terms. The battle was described not as a defeat, but as a heroic stand that delayed the enemy and inflicted damage on their momentum. New medals were issued. Films and posters commemorated the fallen. But beneath the surface, the Stavka conducted a sober assessment of what had gone wrong. Internal documents reveal sharp criticism of command inflexibility, poor intelligence, and catastrophic overcommitment to forward defense strategies. Red Army survivors from the Kyiv encirclement were often viewed with suspicion. Those who escaped capture or returned from German camps were interrogated by the NKVD, sometimes imprisoned or sent to penal battalions. Stalin's regime viewed surrender not as misfortune, but as potential treason. This paranoia led to further purges within the military, compounding the institutional instability already worsened by the 1937-38 officer purges. Yet in the midst of this devastation, signs of recovery began. New Soviet fronts were created, defensive lines were fortified east of the Dnipro, and reinforcements poured into central Ukraine. Though Kyiv was lost, the experience forced a transformation in Soviet war-making. The emphasis shifted from rigid positional defense to more mobile, layered strategies. Civil defense measures improved. Communication protocols were revised, and the use of deception, camouflage, and operational concealment became standardized. The German army, meanwhile, had overextended itself. Though victorious, it now controlled a vast stretch of territory requiring constant policing, supply, and defense. The illusion of invincibility that had accompanied Operation Barbarossa was beginning to crack. Kyiv had fallen, but winter was coming, and Moscow was still far away. The massive success in Ukraine would soon be weighed against the logistical and strategic overreach it created. The aftermath of Kyiv, thus, was not the end of a campaign. It was the prelude to an even larger confrontation that would define the coming months of war. The fall of Kyiv in September 1941 left a legacy that echoed far beyond the ruined fields of Ukraine. It was a battle whose magnitude reshaped strategic planning on both sides of the Eastern Front and became a central symbol in the broader narrative of the Second World War. In military terms, it marked the zenith of German operational success, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of the Blitzkrieg doctrine when executed with full coordination. But historically, it also signaled the beginning of the Wehrmacht's overreach and the slow, grueling shift in momentum that would ultimately lead to Germany's defeat. In the immediate context, the Kyiv encirclement was celebrated by Nazi Germany as one of its greatest victories. Propaganda lauded the capture of over 600,000 Soviet troops, the destruction of dozens of divisions, and the collapse of the Southwestern Front. Military observers across Europe and the world noted the scale of the victory with astonishment. Hitler, convinced by the triumph, doubled down on the southern strategy, intending to seize the Caucasus oil fields and strike deeper into Soviet territory. Yet the time spent achieving this massive encirclement had consequences. Operation Typhoon, the final push toward Moscow, was delayed by weeks. The German advance would soon grind to a halt amid worsening weather and Soviet resistance. For the Soviet Union, Kyiv became both a cautionary tale and a rallying cry. The loss forced painful introspection at the highest levels of command. The rigid doctrine that emphasized holding territory at all costs, the centralization of battlefield decisions in Moscow, and the lack of initiative at lower command levels were all reassessed. In the wake of Kyiv, the Red Army began restructuring its command culture, introducing greater flexibility and recognizing the importance of mobility and coordination. The experience contributed directly to the learning curve that allowed the Soviet military to stabilize the front lines later in 1941 and begin counteroffensives by 1942. Culturally and politically, the battle was embedded into Soviet memory as an epic of sacrifice and betrayal. Official accounts emphasized the heroism of the defenders while minimizing the command failures that led to the catastrophe. Monuments were later erected in Kyiv and across the USSR to commemorate those who fought and died in the encirclement. Veterans of the battle were both honored and scrutinized. Many had to endure the stigma of capture or retreat, which under Stalin's regime could be interpreted as cowardice or disloyalty. Only after Stalin's death did more honest and critical evaluations of the Kyiv campaign begin to emerge within Soviet historiography. For Ukraine, the legacy of the battle was more complex and painful. The German occupation that followed brought horrific crimes, including the systematic extermination of Jews, brutal reprisals against civilians, and widespread destruction. At the same time, the Soviet regime's scorched-earth tactics and purges of perceived unreliable elements before retreat left a deep wound in Ukrainian society. The population found itself trapped between two totalitarian systems, each viewing the region primarily through the lens of military utility and ideological suspicion. The scars of occupation and war would remain visible in Kyiv for decades to come. From a global military historical perspective, the Battle of Kyiv is often studied as a textbook case of operational encirclement and the dangers of strategic inflexibility. It remains one of the largest encirclements in the history of warfare, not just in terms of men captured, but in the sheer collapse of an entire front. Its lessons are still taught in military academies, how initiative, coordination, and adaptability can triumph over static defenses and centralized control, and how even the most spectacular victories can sow the seeds of long-term failure if not aligned with broader strategic goals. In Germany, the triumph at Kyiv would soon fade under the weight of the Eastern Front's growing demands. The Wehrmacht would suffer immense losses in the winter that followed, and the dream of a quick victory over the Soviet Union would vanish. Kyiv, in retrospect, was the peak before the descent, a moment of tactical brilliance achieved at the cost of strategic sustainability. In Soviet memory, Kyiv became a symbol of both tragedy and endurance. The soldiers who died were held up as martyrs of the motherland, their sacrifice used to inspire future generations. The city, eventually liberated in 1943, would rise again, but it would never forget what it had endured. The defense and fall of Kyiv in 1941 thus stands not only as a chapter in the history of the Second World War, but as a turning point in the understanding of total war. It revealed the human cost of strategic miscalculation, the brutality of modern mechanized conflict, and the resilience of nations subjected to existential threats. It is remembered not just for its numbers or its destruction, but for the stories of those who endured, perished, resisted, and survived.